That's right, Martine. The FBI office in Georgia has put out an update saying 4 people have died.
We are following breaking news out of Tennessee.
2 students are dead.
We understand that 5 people are dead.
At least 4 people are dead.
2 men and 1 woman dead.
At least 18 dead.
3 of them died.
And shot dead.
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 Where are the roots of gun control, and where did it all stem from? Even way back in ancient Roman times, people were debating gun control. Well, more so weapon control. Laws like the Lex Julia actually banned regular citizens from carrying weapons in public. The goal of this was to keep people safe and maintain order in their society. The idea of restricting weapons, as you can see, isn't all contemporary. It goes back thousands of years.
In colonial America, guns weren't super common for your everyday citizen. However, there were still rules and laws put in place. Colonists were often required to have guns for military duty, but there were laws banning certain groups like enslaved people, Native Americans, and sometimes Catholics from owning them. Even after the Second Amendment was created, early laws still restricted things like carrying concealed weapons or gun access for non-American citizens.
After the Civil War, many states passed what would be called black codes that made it illegal for African Americans to own guns. This kept power to the whites so that newly freed African Americans were still under some control. Later, in the early 1900s, cities started passing handgun laws. These laws were being created out of what many could say fear around rising crime within emerging cities.
In the 1930s, gang violence was prevalent and pushed the U.S. to pass what they said was to be the first big gun law, called the National Firearms Act. This aimed to crack down on the machine guns and sawed-off shotguns. These weapons in particular were easy to get, however, they were extremely dangerous when used.
The Second Amendment was originally made to make sure that citizens could have the right to defend themselves during times of crisis. This was ratified in 1791, just after the Revolutionary War. Lots of Americans were initially very sus of the government's armies and centralized government power in general. In the end, the Second Amendment goal intended to preserve the right to bear arms so that everyday citizens could form small mini-armies to protect their communities in case tyranny ever ensued. Quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Shows the focus on wanting individual rights as well as a collective defense.
As time went on, the meaning behind the Second Amendment evolved. In recent times, it has become a main point of argument surrounding gun control and reforms. The people who advocate for gun rights see the Second Amendment as a written guarantee for their right to own firearms, for both self-defense and for sports. On the other hand, lots of gun control advocates say that the, quote, well-regulated part of the Second Amendment means that the government has the power to set limits on gun sales to keep the public safe. The Supreme Court was called in on the issue in the 2008 case of District of Columbia v. Heller.
They also said that this right isn't completely unrestricted. It can be subject to restrictions like laws preventing felons and people who are mentally ill from being in possession of a gun. The Second Amendment makes it difficult for the government to pass national laws surrounding guns because the public argue that gun control laws go directly against their right to own guns.
Legislatures face lots of pushback when trying to prevent the easy access of guns, even after mass shootings. But with growing public pressure comes the emergence of new laws and more regulations that aim to balance the rights under the Second with public safety.
What truly is the significance and importance of guns to American citizens, and how can that easy access lead to an increase of violence throughout our society? For many Americans back then and still today, guns aren't just weapons, they are a part of people's identities. By removing these tools can be challenging because many individuals feel like guns are intertwined with their American identity. However, gun control in the US became more controversial when civilians gained access to military-grade weapons. Initially, the guns civilians possessed were used for self-defense and hunting. However, after World War II, leftover military weapons began to find their way into civilians' hands.
Guns like the AR-15, initially designed for military use, became quite popular among civilians seeking firearms during the early 80s. These semi-automatic rifles were created for combat, not everyday use. Congress passed the assault weapons ban in 1994. This banned the sale of new semi-automatic rifles with certain military features and limited magazines to a capacity of 10 rounds. People now had access to extremely dangerous weapons, whose only intent was destruction. The ban expired in 2004, and because of that, since then, the sales of AR-15s and similar military-grade assault rifles rose.
Sadly, access to certain guns like AR-15s has led to numerous mass shootings since then. For an example, Sandy Hook, Las Vegas, and Uvalde, all involving AR-15 style rifles. As of now, people remain deeply divided on the matter. However, there are some lines that need to be drawn. No school shootings should be something that startles no change. Supporters claim that AR-15s are legal, which is accurate. Others say that people need to use them for sports shooting.
Others justify their possession to be useful for home defense, arguing that banning them would violate the Second Amendment. However, many reform advocates argue these guns were built for war, and in my view they are. Advocates say that high-capacity magazines as well as rapid-fire abilities with these powerful guns make them too dangerous in public, especially concerning mass shootings.
The United States alone has had several high-profile assassinations. However, it takes longer for gun reforms to go into action after these assassinations. This can be caused by grief, panic, national lockdown, and paranoia. After an attempt of an assassination, it causes the country to consider a certain legislature to protect people from more attempts from happening.
However, this legislation rarely goes through or takes years to be enacted. In the case of the MLK and RFK assassinations in 1968, even though the Gun Control Act would be passed right afterwards, it wasn't towards making it more difficult to obtain weapons, rather prohibiting certain specific issues due to the NRA having a say in the matter.
Other high-profile assassination attempts that led to no discussion of gun reform were John Lennon, Malcolm X, and President Gerald Ford. These were all nationwide news, yet nothing on the state level would be made to change gun laws at the time. Most recently would be the attempt on Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords in 2011, which would result in 6 killed and Giffords severely injured.
This would only make certain states become slightly stricter on guns and obtaining them, such as background checks, yet Congress would reject anything national to further it. This shows that even if certain assassinations cause thought of gun reforms, there's a high chance of outside interference or Congress outright rejecting any national reforms.
Regardless of the American need to have firearms as their identity and given right, we have always needed regulation. Even before the radicalization and political tainting of gun reform, there was legislation regulating how firearms were to be used. The most prominent example of this reform is the Gun Control Act of 1968.
Under the Gun Control Act, shotguns and rifles and ammunition for shotguns or rifles may be sold only to people who are 18 or older. All firearms other than shotguns and rifles and all ammunition other than ammunition for shotguns or rifles may be sold only to people who are 21 or older.
Licensees are bound by the minimum age requirements established by the Act, regardless of state or local law. If a state has a higher minimum age, then that licensee must obey that higher age. The Act also imposes that the first federal jurisdiction over destructive devices, including bombs, mines, grenades, and other similar devices.
Clearly, there was a need for regulation around gun reform before the polarization of the topic in the 1980s. Both sides agreed that it was necessary to set some sort of restrictions to protect the well-being of our nation.
Let's talk about the NRA, or the National Rifle Association. The National Rifle Association was founded in 1871 by the National Guard and retired Army officers in New York who vowed to promote rifle practice and improve marksmanship. The first president, Civil War General Ambrose Burnside, had seen too many Union soldiers who couldn't shoot straight. For generations thereafter, the NRA focused on shooting, hunting, and conservation, and no one thought of it as a gun lobby. Its ideals were very straightforward, and it had no political association. All of this changed in the late 70s because in 1971, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms killed a member of the NRA for housing multiple firearms. This would cause the creation of the Institute of Legislative Action. The head of this, ILA, would be Harlan Carter, a Texan lawyer known for being anti-immigrant.
The NRA would decrease the staff of the ILA in 1977 and would cause major upset with Harlan Carter, who would stage a revolt at the Cincinnati Convention in 1977, the climax of the radicalization of the NRA. On May 21, 1977, and into the morning of May 22nd, gun rights radicals took over the annual meeting of the NRA. They wore orange blaze hunting caps and spoke on walkie-talkies. The organization was thoroughly mainstream and bipartisan, focusing on hunting, conservation, and marksmanship. It taught Boy Scouts how to shoot safely. But the world had changed and everything was more political.
The rebels saw the NRA leaders as elites who lacked the heart and the conviction to fight against the gun control legislation. After this revolt, the NRA helped invent culture wars and kept inflaming them. In the process, the NRA overcame tremendous internal issues and existential crisis, developed an astonishing grassroots operation, and became closely aligned with the Republican Party. Today, it's the most powerful lobbying organization in the nation's capital. Not only did the NRA become radicalized for the protection of guns, but also in the 1990s, after Republicans took control of Congress, Newt Gingrich announced, "As long as I'm the Speaker of the House, no gun control legislation is going to move."
From that point on, the Republican Party was closely aligned with anti-gun control. Republican candidates came to rely more and more on gun lobby contributions. In the year 2000, the NRA contributed close to $3 million to Republican campaigns, representing 92% of its total contributions. Overall, the radicalization of the NRA and the alignment of the Republican Party with it is hard to pin down on one moment. It was a collection of being misinformed and wanting free range with gun control and the political power that money has.
Actions of gun violence unfortunately rarely result in some form of gun reform or legislative change. In modern-day media, we often see some form of gun-related violence occurring, either being suicide, homicide, or mass murder. Based on research from the National Library of Medicine, studies show that people will give less support to the idea of gun legislation if it was suicide, injured, or homicide compared to mass shootings.
Another reason for the lack of gun reforms is currently due to both the House and Senate being controlled by the majority being Republicans. During another study between Democrats and Republicans from the Pew Research Center, it was found that 83% of Republicans in the survey found that it is more important to protect gun ownership laws than to make stricter gun control laws.
However, 84% of the Republicans in that survey agreed that guns should be harder to obtain, yet this poses an issue on whether or not people should do something about it. Another issue is that assassinations and attempts. It's often found that bigger events will bring more media attention to it. Assassinations and mass murders are the two things that bring most attention to people. This often doesn't lead to gun reforms, rather than more protection and isolation of said figures in order to keep them safe.
In the case of the JFK assassination and Ronald Reagan shooting, it led to tighter security, but also demanded gun reforms, in both cases doing so. So, due to the sheer number of gun-related crimes, it doesn't lead to gun reforms or people batting an eye, as it's viewed as everyday life. Yet, in cases of higher murder or popular figures, it would almost certainly bring attention to gun reforms.
How have mass shootings or high-profile assassinations triggered gun reform in a contemporary time, such as today? Assassinations and shooting, amongst many other tragedies, have provoked people to speak up and say something has to be done. However, things aren't always done, and action isn't always the reality of things. During the 1960s, 3 prominent leaders were assassinated: President John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. People were shocked that it was so easy to obtain a firearm back then. To obtain one, it was easy as going into a store and buying a piece of candy. That's when President Lyndon B. Johnson stepped in and pushed for stricter gun laws. This led to the Gun Control Act of 1968, a piece of legislation that did a key few things. First, it banned mail-order guns because that's how one of the assassinations had acquired his. It mandated that guns carry serial numbers so they could be tracked. It banned certain individuals like criminals and mentally ill persons from buying guns. It required more background checks on individuals trying to obtain a firearm. It also gave the government more power to oversee gun sales.
Then came school shootings. There was the Columbine Massacre of 1999, and it was everywhere in the news. The situation was horrific, yet the government did not pass any significant laws in response to these actions. However, it resulted in greater attention to in-school safety and monitoring. There were also increased discussions regarding gun storage and background checks. This led to new state laws being enacted in some areas. 10 years passed and 130 school shootings later. In 2012, the Sandy Hook shooting occurred, resulting in the deaths of 20 young children and 6 teachers. Barack Obama called for stricter laws, including better background checks and banning certain guns, such as the AR-15. However, Congress did not pass it due to too much opposition. These laws were attempted to be put in place, but shootings kept happening, and there was still opposition and people claiming that they need weapons like the AR-15. Even so, the states like Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts enacted their own gun laws for public safety. Then, in 2018, there was the Parkland school shooting in Florida. This one was different because students made their voices heard and protested after the shooting.
The surviving students saw this opportunity to use their experience to show the world how dangerous and important this matter is, that change needs to be enacted. This pressure would pay off as Florida would pass new laws, including raising the age to buy a rifle to 21 and implementing red flag laws to keep guns away from dangerous individuals. At the federal level, Congress would pass the Fix NICS Act to improve national background checks for all firearms. Mass shootings, as mentioned a moment ago, often spark gun reform, but to the extent of change often occurs depending on the politics. Some events lead to significant federal laws like in 1968, but a lot of the time reform can be constructed at the federal level and only occurs in certain states. Still, many of these tragedies will always reignite the conversation around gun safety and background checks. Response: gun violence seems to push people to call for change. There are times when reforms or simple attempts to reform go nowhere, especially when there's a split in Congress. However, almost every time an incident prompts new controversy and new conversations, it leads to some kind of action, especially in individual states. Politicians after shootings or attempts at assassination were all over the place.
After someone tried to shoot President Reagan in the early 1980s, his press secretary James Brady was severely injured. Brady and his wife fought hard for stricter gun laws, which resulted in the Brady Bill in 1993 that mandated background checks before purchasing a handgun and established a waiting period before one could take the gun home. It is also important to note that different political parties respond in different ways. Historically, Democrats are likely to want more regulations, like background checks and banning certain guns. However, Republicans often focus on protecting gun rights, maintaining their emphasis on topics like mental health or school safety. Following a shooting, there may be a lot of rhetoric, speeches, and moments of silence, but often nothing is truly done. We've witnessed hundreds of people die from shootings, assassinations, and other forms of gun violence. Yet the debate continues on whether we need laws that help control gun rights. Why, you may ask? Well, that's because it's difficult to enact a new law unless everyone agrees. This makes it extremely difficult because we live in a country where disagreement pushes change. However, on this topic, disagreement divides us and doesn't allow us to make change. Additionally, groups like the NRA, which promote gun rights, are historically influential and can block new laws. At the same time, activist organizations, and especially young people like us, push hard for that change.
When public sentiment surrounding gun laws and their interpretation is at an all-time high, the Supreme Court has to step in to settle these disputes. One of the first disputes is the District of Columbia v. Heller. The background of this law under scrutiny during the case comes from the provisions of the District of Columbia Code that made it illegal to carry an unregistered firearm and prohibited the registration of handguns. The code also contained provisions that required owners of lawfully registered firearms to keep them unloaded and disassembled or bound by a trigger lock or other similar devices unless the firearms were located in a place of business or being used for legal recreational activities. In a simplified form, they were required to be useless for immediate use.
The actual case was brought forth by Dick Anthony Heller, a DC Special Police Officer who was authorized to carry a handgun while on duty. He applied for a 1-year license for a handgun. He wished to keep it home, but his application was denied. He sought an injunction against the enforcement of the relevant parts of the code and argued that they violated his Second Amendment right to keep a functional firearm in his home without a license. The district court dismissed the complaint. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit reversed and held that the Second Amendment protects the right to keep firearms in the home for self-defense, and the District of Columbia's requirement that firearms kept in the home be non-functional violated that right.
This is the first of many examples of court cases revolving around gun control. In this particular one, the Second Amendment overruled the pre-existing law and made it easier to possess functioning firearms at home. The second case is McDonald versus City of Chicago. Several suits were filed against Chicago and Oak Park in Illinois, challenging their gun bans after Supreme Court issued its opinion on the District of Columbia versus Heller. In this case, the argument was made that the Second Amendment should also apply to the states. While originally dismissed, on the appeal, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit affirmed a very recent case surrounding domestic abuse and the availability of weapons in the United States versus Rahimi.
Zach Raimi was involved in violent incidents in Arlington, Texas, including multiple shootings and a hit-and-run. He was under a civil protective order for alleged assault against his ex-girlfriend, which prohibited him from possessing firearms. Police searched his home and found a rifle and a pistol, and he was indicted. Raimi moved to dismiss the indictment on constitutional grounds, but was denied. In all of these cases, the argument can be made that individuals have the right to possess firearms, but it is the duty of our court system to interpret the Constitution and Second Amendment to protect our society from people who would cause harm.
Public pressure plays a large role in influencing legislators to act on gun reform. Things like large school shootings and mass death usually lead to the public having an emotional response to the actions and lead to demand for action. This helps legislators feel more need to pass reforms and create a change. In 2022, Gallup News ran a public poll and found that public support for stricter gun laws jumped 14% from 52% to 66%, just after several famous mass shootings. They also found that 55% of Americans said that they support the passing of new gun laws as well as further enforcing existing ones. This is the highest level of support for this since 2001.
This shows an obvious shift in the public's views after mass shootings and shows how national crises lead to a large push for legislation surrounding gun reform. The public pressure doesn't just push for reforms, it turns into actual political consequences. The same poll from Gallup News shows that 55% of voters considered laws surrounding guns to be, quote, extremely important, and took much consideration to it when deciding their vote during the midterm elections.
Since so many voters are valuing this so highly, it made legislators more likely to respond, especially when voters from both parties agreed on the simple ideas like background checks for gun buyers, red flag laws which are designed to prevent violence by taking away firearms before a person can harm themselves or others. It is also important to note that during the time of the survey, Congress was being pushed to pass one of its largest gun laws since the 90s, the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which touched on all and more of the ideas mentioned earlier. The trend of public support driving action after mass shootings even holds true in pro-gun religions.
The University of Houston ran a survey in 2025 and found that 85% of Texans, which included both Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, support a ban on assault rifles for people under the age of 21. After the horrendous 2022 Uvalde school shootings, the families of these victims wanted these reforms to be put in place. In response, lawmakers implemented lots of bills, one of which was SB 4, which seeks to raise the legal age for purchasing assault rifles. The fact that the bill was supported by both political parties show how the public's opinion can drive legislatures to act, even in states with a large pro-gun community.
What we can take away from gun reforms in the United States is that they're too rare and too far apart to do any good. In surveys and polls, it shows that even Republicans and Democrats may want safer gun control laws in order to keep the safety high.
To grow as a country would be to admit that we need to realize that reforms need to happen, as the number of shootings will most likely grow exponentially. The NRA also needs to level out the playing field in order to let changes happen.
Understanding that as much as it might infringe on other people's personal beliefs, there is still an issue revolving around guns and defending it. Using the same Second Amendment argument is entirely useless if people are going to still go out and hurt each other.